First things first, people talk a lot about the Commission, right? And the Commission in the EU is this body of officials who run the EU day to day. They're sort of like the UK civil service, the UK government, but the equivalent in the EU. But to put that into kind of perspective, the entire EU budget, including the Commission and everything else the EU does, is about 1% of EU GDP, which is just a measure of how much economic activity there is in a place. To put that into perspective, the UK government spends about 40% of UK GDP, whereas they only spend 1%. The EU Commission actually employs fewer people than Birmingham City Council, just to kind of really put that in perspective. So let's get back to this contentious topic of the EU Commission, how it's chosen. So people talk a lot about unelected bureaucrats. Firstly, all bureaucrats are unelected. That's the thing about bureaucrats. The civil service isn't elected either. And in fact also, ministerial positions are usually unelected. They certainly are in the UK. Or if you compare to sort of a completely different system, the US, which is sort of the size of the EU, but then it's a country like the UK and it's got this federal system going on, so it's a little bit different. But fundamentally, those positions that are the equivalent of ministers in the UK or commissioners in the EU, that equivalent position is also unelected. They're chosen by the elected president, and the president is elected, and they choose somebody to be the minister, and they're approved or rejected by the Senate. Ministers in the UK are appointed by the Prime Minister. Now, unlike the US, there's no democratic oversight there. The Prime Minister appoints them, that's it, it's done. Now, they are usually MPs, but there's no law saying they have to be MPs, and occasionally they aren't. Reasonably often they're lords, so for example the current government and the coalition government before it and Labour before that have had lords in the cabinet, and very occasionally you'll have somebody who isn't a lord and isn't an MP appointed to the cabinet. Very, very rare, but it technically can happen. Technically speaking, the Prime Minister doesn't have to be an MP. So, how is the Prime Minister chosen? Formally speaking, the Queen chooses the Prime Minister. Now obviously she doesn't really choose the Prime Minister. Britain is weird, I know we're a strange country. The Queen accepts whoever Parliament tells her, and basically if you can get a majority of Parliament to agree that you're the Prime Minister, the Queen will always agree. That's the way it works in the real world. In most European countries, what they do is, rather than having a Queen who does that, they have an elected President who does that. And the elected President chooses the Prime Minister, and the Prime Minister chooses, or in Germany it's the Chancellor. But either way, they choose that person, and that person then leads the government. So what the EU does is it has the leaders of each of the EU countries act collectively like a president or like the Queen. So they choose the person who is going to be head of the Commission in exactly the same way that, formally speaking, the Queen does here, and in more in European countries, the President does over there. And they choose the head of the Commission, who confusingly is also called President, but it's just a title, doesn't mean he's actually, like, they chose the word President, it was a terrible choice, they should have gone with Secretary General or something. It's very, very confusing, and I apologise for that. That is my biggest criticism of the EU. You can't call everybody President. They have like 5 people they've called President, and none of them have the responsibilities for a President. It's a position completely different to that of a President. It's much more like a Prime Minister. Then there are 28 other commissioners, 1 chosen by each state. So the national government of the UK will pick 1 minister, the national government of Belgium will pick 1 commissioner, and that's true for each of the 28 member states. Then that whole block, that whole commission, so the 28 commissioners plus the president of the commission, the head of the commission, they're all sort of sent to the Parliament for like a yes or no, and the Parliament either says yes, these people can be the Commission, or no, they can't. And so this is essentially the same process as in the UK. The biggest difference is that they're not voting, they're voting for the Commission as a whole, rather than the specific person who is the equivalent of the Prime Minister, and also that it's not usually the head of the largest party in the European Parliament, although they have now by precedent, although not by law, changed that. So they now have, sort of similar to the UK, how the Prime Minister will be somebody who the Parliament has sort of endorsed. In the same way, the European Union now has this sort of precedent where the person chosen as head of the Commission will be somebody that the European Parliament has endorsed. So why does it work that way? Why not just do it through the Parliament directly? Why do it through the 28 leaders of the member states at all? Would that be more democratic? And I think you could argue that yes, it would in many ways be more democratic. So why not? Why not do it that way? And the answer is because the kind of people who are now arguing for Brexit wanted it that way. They wanted more power in the hands of national governments. So who chooses now? National governments choose the Commission. That's why the Commission is chosen that way, to put more power in the hands of national governments as opposed to the wider sort of EU electorate. Now we could, for example, collectively elect a president in the same way. I think that would be a mistake for a bunch of reasons. I don't think the presidential system is a very helpful one for a whole number of reasons. But we could do that EU-wide, but that would transfer power from national governments to the EU as a whole, or the EU electorate as a whole, which is something that the Brexit people are arguing against. That's their whole argument, is that we should be against that. So to also complain about the way the Commission is chosen, to me just makes no sense. The reason we do it the way we do it is because it was felt it was a balance between the power of nation states. Nation states are the ones appointing, nation states are the ones deciding who the commissioners are and who the head of the commission is, but then it's approved or rejected by Parliament, which is directly elected by the people. And that is how it works, and why it works that way. I hope that makes it clearer. I know it's a complicated subject. I'm sorry, this is the best I could do. I hope that really helps.